Hi, authors. Welcome to Author Nation. I am Melody Ann, your host. And Author Nation is the place you want to be because we are here, authors, helping authors. So if you have not subscribed to the Author Nation YouTube channel, do it now. We have live interviews every Thursday where you get to come and ask the questions. And today we are going to be talking about shaping your story for impact. Super important conversation. We spend a lot of time writing and publishing our books because we have an important message to tell. We have something we want to share with the world. And so our guest today is going to be talking about his book, and it's all about shaping your story for impact. So Mattias Martens was born in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. And he grew up in Teslin, Yukon. Don't worry if you're not from Canada and you don't know where those are. They're both beautiful places. Ever passionate about fantasy and fable at UBC, at the University of British Columbia, he developed a keen interest in why humans believe what they do and how our beliefs shape the communities we form. He now lives and works as a programmer and writer in Vancouver, British Columbia, and his spirit animal is the vampire squid. Please welcome Mattias Martens. Hey, Mattias, how are
Hi,
you?
Hi, Melody. I'm good. Thank you. Good to be here.
Great. Okay, first question, vampire squid, your spirit animal. Tell us a little bit about that.
Vampire squid.
Yeah.
Well, vampire squids are my spirit animal because they like to float in in like the infinite blackness, and they're very passive. They have these big bulging eyes because it's extremely dark down there, and they just reel in little bits of food, and that's pretty much their entire lifestyle. And being called vampire, they have something that resembles a cape, but they have this air of being kind of quiet and misunderstood, and I guess I resonate with that.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I do. I love that. And they glow because they're so deep, right? So they have luminescence.
Melody, I'm afraid they do not glow.
Oh, I thought they
Their
had
eyes
luminescence.
glow
Oh,
when they like if you go down and you get to see them in their environment, they glow because their eyes are so reflective because they try to
oh.
capture as much light as they can.
And
But in their natural environment, they're totally dark, just like a vampire.
oh, and I thought it was bioluminescence. I thought they had to, I'll have to go read up about my vampire squids now. All right.
Oh,
So,
please do.
yeah. So tell me a little bit about when you became interested in the purpose of stories.
Yeah. Well, that's always been something I cared about a lot. I think part of what happened is, growing up, stories were part of how I understood the world, but also part of how I escaped from it, right? And
Mhm.
then in university, I started to become more aware of the links between fantasy and reality. So I think one of the things that might have kicked this off was a book called The Lord of the Rings and
Yeah.
Philosophy, which was a bunch of essays about different aspects of that world and how they connected to certain positions and like existentialism or like the nature of truth and all sorts of different topics, right? So it showed that, we may think of fantasy as being an escape, but in many ways we bring the world with us. And then, of course, I wrote a fantasy novel called The Goer, which I published back in 2017, I believe. And that immediately led to a much more serious episode of soul searching about fantasy. Like, why do I want to tell these stories?
Mhm.
Uh, and that's how I became interested in that.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Well, we'll talk about fantasy another time because now I'm like, ooh, I just saw Dune, so we'll have to talk about that another time. And the goer, we'll have to get that in the description for people as well. So if people want to check out your fiction work, because you write fiction and nonfiction, so we'll have to get that into the description as well. But before
Oh, of
that,
course.
when you started forming ideas for the book, like what questions did you have? What were you asking yourself? What were those big questions you wanted answers to?
I think the biggest thing for me is I had kind of a pet model of what stories do to people as they read them, which
Mm-hmm.
I write about on my blog. It was something that I picked up in English class about how anytime you read something, it engages your subconscious mind as well as your conscious mind. And both of those things are influenced. So your conscious influence, you might have a conscious understanding of, but it might also influence you in ways that you aren't aware of. But I still wanted to, narrow that down and come up with something more specific. Because if I just tell you as a writer, you're going to influence your reader subconsciously, so be aware of that. Odds are you'll go, okay, I'm aware of that. Now what, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to see if there's something more specific that I could say, and that's where I hit on the idea of questions, which is a very important framing device within the book. But I think we'll go into that a little bit more later on.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are, it's interesting because you're offering some, practical ways to get there. And a lot of authors get advice like tell stories and, show, don't tell. And, but sometimes telling is a great thing to do and sometimes showing. So just, getting that practical advice of, when to tell stories, how to tell stories, how they affect people so that you can, integrate them well. I think that's great. So tell me, so what led you to the answers? So you had all these questions. How did you come about finding the answers to these?
Yeah, well, there was a couple of different steps, and it unfolded over years because some of these ideas were just sort of, if you will, lying dormant in my mind from like my university days, and other ones were, well, there was. I'll focus on just one. There was a book I read in the same year that I started writing How to Do Things with Stories, called The Sense of Style. That's by Steven Pinker, who's a cognitive scientist, but also a prolific popular science writer. And he basically wrote Sense of Style to show people the light that linguistics can shed on how to write clearly and communicate effectively. And that book, in addition to being fascinating for its content, was also a very effective guide to writing. I think it improved my writing quite a lot and renewed my enthusiasm for it. But there's something about the approach that he took that inspired me, because he really brought it down to the nuts and bolts. Like, you're writing a sentence. What's going to happen to your reader as they read that sentence?
Yeah.
And I wanted to take that same approach, which he was mostly directing at nonfiction authors, although it's perfectly applicable to fiction authors as well. But I wanted to take that basic approach, that basic angle, and apply it to writing fiction. So you're writing a story. People are reading about these characters and imagining those experiences that they're having in their minds. And what does that process look like? Like, what does it look like while it's happening, and how do they remember it afterward? And that was what I built on to come up with, the answers I give in my book.
Yeah. No, that's cool. And this is a little offshoot kind of comment question, but sometimes I'm working with authors and they say, "Oh, I've been working on this book for years," and they feel guilty about it. They feel that somehow, taking a germ of an idea and letting it percolate over several years and reading about it, and that somehow that's not a good thing. But I think that people who've had these ideas, you have an idea for 10 years and you write about it on your blog and you read and talk about to other people. So can you just tell me a little bit about the experience of having this little, seed of an idea, and that experience of over, however many years it's been, having those conversations? How has that really benefited the book?
I think you're spot on, Melody, with that. That's really, I really agree. It did improve the book, and I think that's true of anybody who's been thinking about things for a long time in a state of vagueness. Sometimes clarity is very slow in coming, and I find when clarity hits, it's like a bolt of lightning, and it animates you, and you go out and write your book. I think that's fantastic. Like, some of these things need time to age in your mind, like a barrel of scotch, right? I know like the basic ideas I'd been ruminating on, just in my head as I was like waiting for the bus or walking down the streets of Vancouver. Um, and it just one step at a time through those rememberings uh, formed into something more concrete. And it was so interesting that I only became aware of this when I looked back. For my blog, I thought I would do a little bit of forensics and figure out where some of my ideas actually came from. And I realized that like a lot of them came from an English course I'd taken at UBC back in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And it had been so long that I didn't really know that anymore. So it was interesting to see the way that things progressed from their origins like that.
Yeah. Awesome. And that's that. Just anyone listening, blog, right? Just what Mattias just said. I have this record of my blogs and my ideas and where they came from, and that's so precious for a writer, right? That's amazing. So just blog, right? It's a promotion for blogging. So let's talk a little bit about the book. My standard question: what is the promise of the book? Let's start there.
That's a great question. The core promise of my book is, per the title, to show people how, through a story that they tell, they can do something, meaning they can have some kind of impact on the readers and how they see the world. And I went back a little bit back and forth when I was forming the idea for the book of like, how megalomaniacal do I sound when I say that you can write a story and do anything you want with it and like mold people's minds and brainwash people. But I came to understand that this process, like, it can be seen in two very different ways. And there's always a little bit of a limit that you hit in terms of, like, if you really want to impact people, then you've often got to sacrifice some certainty about what the impact will be. Whereas if you want to impact people in a very specific way, like you want them to eat more Chicago deep dish pizza, say you want to like save the reputation of Chicago deep dish pizza, you could write a book that's just about that, but it's a fairly shallow influence. You're just trying to change their dining habits. You have a better shot at like influencing them and doing things if you have a specific goal like that. But to bring it back to the question, the promise is you might learn how to, write a story that produces the intended effect. But the promise is that you will, with your story, be able to understand what influence it will have. Mm-hmm. That might be overstating it a little bit, but it's a way to think about it.
Yeah.
I promise that you will have a way to think about how stories influence people and ultimately change their minds.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, devil's advocate here. Why should writers think about impact? I mean, just, I'm writing what I'm writing. People can take it or leave it. Why should I think about impact?
Yeah, well, I think I have the view that writers have a responsibility to think about impact in the same way that people have a responsibility to think about the effects of their words in any situation. Like, we're often taught to ask when we're talking to our friends, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And it needs to be at least two of those things in order to say it, right?
Right.
I think the same thing applies when you tell a story. And the point that I really want to hammer home with this book is that you always have an impact. If you tell a story that people read and people care about, it will always change the way they see the world in some small way. And ultimately, the choice is not whether to influence people, but whether to be aware of that power that you have.
So what I'm hearing you say essentially is, look, you're going to make an impact. Whether you're trying to make an impact or not, you are going to make an impact. So why not do it in a thoughtful way? Why not
Yeah,
do it?
exactly.
Yeah, be conscious of it and self-aware. Yeah. All right, so let's flip this question around just a little bit. I want to make an impact. And so people who want to make an impact often think that, they're writing a nonfiction book, everything they say must be true. There can be no fiction in it, where, fiction isn't about impact. Fiction is about entertainment. Whereas nonfiction is about impact. I'm stretching a little bit, but you get the gist. So, if I want to make impact, why should I think about creative writing and fiction?
Hmm. I think, well, a framing example that I've
Mhm.
given in the past, not in my book, but other times that I've talked about this book, is let's take an environmental cause, such as protecting sea turtles.
Mhm.
Um, I think people will certainly use writing and communication if they want to, teach people to do their part to protect the species, right?
Mhm.
Um, and of course, generally, if you're someone who cares about this, you will likely feel indignant that other people don't care about it too. It's very
Mm.
human to expect other people to care about the things you do, especially when they're things um, that are so like viscerally important
Yeah.
uh, as like saving a kind of wildlife. Um, so in that framing, you might think, you know, I already know that people care. My job is to inform them and then tell them what to do. Um, and what I would advise is that the lessons of storytelling apply even if you're not writing fiction, and even if you're writing nonfiction or like an informational pamphlet. Um, there is a more powerful method of persuasion to compel people toward a specific act than simply to tell them to do that action. So for the sea turtle example, I would say the non-narrative, the non-artistic mode of communication would be, you know, to say things like, in order to save the sea turtles, uh, write to your local congressman, say X, Y, and Z. And, and to be clear, there is obviously a place for that. But the role of stories is that they provide emotion and motive, and they model the behavior, because humans like to imitate, and we tend
Mhm.
to be much more effective at imitation than we are at action. So if in a story we say, you know, here's how this fictional person learned about the dangers posed to turtles
Mhm.
and what they learned to do. And then in story, we say, this person has learned these problems and has learned what they can do, and they're starting to do it, but they're wondering, is it going to be enough? Right? So the story ends with this little bit of ambiguity, this little bit of uncertainty. And that, of course, mirrors perfectly the uncertainty in the real world of like, is it enough? Do enough people care about protecting the sea turtles or whatever issue it might be?
Yeah.
And that's what ultimately has the power to pull people in and compel them to act.
Yeah. No, great argument. Nice. Well, let's talk about shaping story then. So, what does it mean for a writer to build a story around an intended impact? And maybe, well, after that, we'll talk about process. So, what does it mean for a writer to build a story around an intended impact?
Mm. Well, I think we can call back some of that that last little diatribe.
Yeah.
That like it's this is one of the trade-offs in approaching an issue like this through narrative rather than through an informative style, is that if you have a message, one option will always be to write the message down and then publish your expression of that message, and boom, you've got your message out there, right? With stories, it works a little differently. So, as I was saying, there's a question that you want to put in the reader's mind. And by answering that question, they will, if everything has gone as intended, see things or see this issue the way you do. So the example in this case is, I want people to care about sea turtle conservation. And then the framing question is, are the current efforts enough to make sure that sea turtles have a future and they won't go extinct? And then that question can be partly answered in fiction through a dramatic question. So that means you may have heard, Melody, the term dramatic question before, right? In storytelling workshops. It's like, that's the question of the drama, like what will happen in the drama. So then you have characters who are engaging in some kind of role. And then the question is like, what will happen to them? And then the resolution of the dramatic question then leaves this kind of ghost in the subconscious of what I call the shadow question, which is the more general version of that question, the version that then maps back to the real world and then hopefully has the intended impact.
Yeah.
So
nice.
Roughly speaking, that's the process I'm describing when I talk about shaping a story based on an impact.
Yeah, perfect. So just for everyone listening, if you are live and you would like to ask a question, just go ahead and drop it in the comments. Or if you just have something to add, drop it in the comments. And also, if you're listening on the replay, stay tuned because there is lots more to come. And I've just thrown something up. Get your copy of How to Do Things with Stories. So as we're talking about this is a brand new book that Mattias has put out, and he's selling it through LeanPub. So this will also be in the description. You don't have to madly write it out. You can just pop down to the description. It will be there. So go ahead and grab your copy. And I just want to listen a little side bit again. I just want to talk about LeanPub. Why did you decide to publish through LeanPub? We'll get back on track in just a minute. Question popped in my head.
Yeah, that's a great question. I chose LeanPub. One of the things that really appealed to me is that you can publish things as you're writing. So you write a chapter, you add it to the behind the scenes manuscript that you're building at LeanPub. At every stage, they turn it into an ebook in various formats for people to download and read. So people can purchase or download or like sign up for the book at any point and then receive updates as it goes along. I thought that was a really cool feature. And I also like just how lightweight it was. Like often publishing can be quite daunting. So when you have something that just lets you upload some plain text and then it turns it into an ebook that looks good and is readable, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And if I may, I just wanted to add about this. Another thing I like about LeanPub is they have a really flexible way, like payment method. So if you go to leanpub.com's page for my book, you'll see a little slider that shows how much you want to pay. And the default price is $5. But I want anyone who wants to read this book to be able to read it. So you can take that slider and drag it down to $0. And then you get the book for free.
Yeah.
Which is, LeanPub made that really painless to make that possible.
And you can pay more too, right?
You can pay up to $20 if you feel so inclined. And
exactly.
I would, of course, appreciate that.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's what's great. It's like, I want this book out there for people. So, if you can't afford it, but you want to write it, $0. But if you can and you want to support an author, which I think is always a great thing to do, just spend a little more. All right, let's talk about, writer has finished their first draft, right? So we have this first draft. I've kind of, I've thought about your process of trying to do everything that you've done. What do I do next? What's your advice for me here?
Well, if you already have a draft written, I find it interesting because, I wrote this book to address existential questions that writers have about like, why did I do this? Or why am I about to do this? Or once I do this, how will I convince other people that they should care that I did this? You know, I'm going to address all of these questions. I think in some ways it's easier to see what to do if you've already got a draft written, because, you know, the creative process, like starting from the seed of an idea, like how I want to affect the world, or like more conventionally, you know, I want a story about, you know, some kind of interesting premise that no one's heard before. Even then, once you have that kernel of an idea, growing it into a story is very hard, and I applaud anybody who manages to do it.
Yeah.
But even then, you know, once you've created it, there's still opportunity for another twilight of the soul, right? Another existential crisis of like, I've made it, now what do I do with it, right? So I think the lessons of how to do things with stories apply to a draft in asking, say this goes out into the world and a lot of people read it. How will it change how they think about certain issues, right? How do you think it will change how they think about the central themes of the story? And it does provide a kind of instruction manual for playing this out, you know, like you imagine your plot, you imagine the characters and the process of readers empathizing with certain characters and caring about their struggles and wanting to know what happens next. And, you know, having this dramatic question, like the readers will ask the dramatic question themselves, maybe not in those words, but they'll want to know what the answer is, right? Mm-hmm. So then through that, inevitably, because when we read a story and we empathize with characters, we link those characters back to people, maybe not literal people, but ideas of people in our own lives. And then the way that struggle plays out in the story has an effect on how we consider the logic of the real world. Yeah. And then through that, it gets people to ask questions about the real world. So you can work backward from those questions to decide what story to tell, but you can also look at what you've already written and feel out how the reading process will likely go. Mm-hmm. And then this can help you in two ways. One way would be if the effect is not what you want, it's not what you set out to do, then that will give some clues as to how to, you know, re-architect things so that it does flow the way you want to and does lead to the questions you wanted them to ask. Mm-hmm. And the second way it can help you is if you notice, you know, it gives you something to check your story against. So like, as you're reading it, sometimes things are off, but you don't know exactly why. Sometimes it's because you wrote something that doesn't make sense, or it has a gap that you haven't thought through. That's a more conventional plotting problem to have. But sometimes it happens because the central conflict at this moment doesn't connect back to the theme. And then that's a different type of problem to have, right? So how to align all of the conflicts with the themes and with the central questions of your story. I think that's a place where how to do things with stories has some quite relevant advice.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think, you know, writing myself, you know, I write something and sometimes I think it's garbage and sometimes I'm in love with it. And, you know, sometimes I shouldn't be in love with it. And sometimes what I think is garbage is actually a good start to something brilliant, you know, so it's, you know, once you have the first draft out, this is really a time to come back and, you know, revisit it and revise it and get other eyes on it as well. I always say you can't get any feedback until you have the words on a piece of paper, right? You know, getting that first draft out opens up this whole possibility to do what you're saying. It's like go through it and make sure all the conflicts, you know, go with the theme. And you've talked about your book, you know, kind of helping people go through that. So could you talk a little bit about the organization or structure of the book itself?
Absolutely. Yes. So in the first chapter, I talk about kind of, I hesitate to say that this book is informed by neuroscience. Like, I myself am not a formally trained neuroscientist, but there's a kind of intuition about how the brain works that I play with and use as like the framing device for the book. And this is where I talk about like what it means for a story to influence a person on a subconscious level. And then from there, I build up the concept of questions in stages. So the first part is ambiguity. So the idea being that in any story, there are going to be various types of unknowns that are presented to the reader, just as a consequence of the fact that, you know, you can't say everything all at once. So there's always at every step going to be some ambiguity, whether intentional or unintentional. And that creates the uncertainty, which then compels the reader to consider possible answers and then form a preference. And then once they formed a preference, that leads to what I call tension. And actually, that's not just my term.
Yeah.
So I talk about the idea of narrative tension.
Yes.
It comes from ambiguity, and then tension gets people preferring one outcome over another, so they care about how the story is going to unfold. And then that tension, that wanting, then leads firstly to dramatic questions like, will things turn out the way I want? And then also to the deeper questions of like, what does this say about the world I live in?
Yeah.
So that's the first 4 chapters. And then excellent. Once that core is established, I then apply it. So I actually try to practice what I preach for a chapter, start from an idea of, and the idea I went with is the concept of soulmates, the idea that every person is a person they were made for. And I attempt to tell a story that destabilizes and deconstructs that idea. So that's chapter 5. And then the rest of the book, that's kind of about the halfway point. The rest of the book talks about this model and how it applies to different aspects. So I have a chapter that talks about primarily about fantasy and like the role of making sense. How important is it to write a story where things go the way you would expect in the real world? And also, how important is consistency? Like, when is it important to have a consistent logic throughout your story? And when is it okay to throw that away in service of making things, of like creating the plot beat that you want? Because contrary to some advice you might hear, there are definitely times where it's okay to break the rules and have something happen that makes no sense based on what you were expecting leading up to it. There's lots of great stories that do this. So I try to, tackle issues like that in the latter half of the book.
Brilliant. And we actually have a question coming in from Megan Daniels. Thank you, Megan. And the question is, what fiction, this is a good one. What fiction had the most impact on you, and what question did it raise? What a great question.
That is a good question. Thanks, Meg. I think to think about that, I have to go back to, because the books that influenced me the most were the books that I read when I was just a wee little lad. Of course.
It's normal, right? So normal.
And I think one of them, probably one that stuck with me the most, sometimes subconsciously, is Ender's Game. I don't know if everyone in the audience will know it. It was certainly a big young adult science fiction series when I was a kid. But there were aspects of that, of like a little kid who's inducted into a military training program and has to deal with, kind of human nature and bullying, and at the same time that becomes a microcosm for violence at the level of societies, the way that like humans struggle to set aside their differences and make peace. And then also the way that we reckon with the complete alien, because that's what the story is about, is the human war with an insectoid race and the issues that come up there with their war of extermination, which they see as a fight of a fight for survival. So I mean, I think it's tricky to articulate the questions, isn't it?
It is, and that's okay.
They're all throughout that, aren't they?
Yeah, no, that's brilliant.
Like, yeah, like humans, and like, why do we sometimes, choose violence when we could choose peace, or could choose to connect?
Yeah.
I saw that as the central question, and that's what stuck with me from that story.
No, that's brilliant.
So, that's a great question. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, it reminds me, one of the books I read in high school was The Chrysalids. And that, I don't know if you've read that one. That really...
It rings a little bell.
Yeah. And just, how humans really need this, everything to be the same so they feel safe. And we get into this very controlled society, and evolution and change and growth is scary, right? And other is scary, and there's more to it. But it was a question for you, not me. I'm not going to, get more into it. But your answer reminded me of reading that, and how that shaped me. Talking about reading, do you have an excerpt you could read for us?
I do, yes. So this excerpt is it's from a little bit later on in the book, and it's about the creative process and the struggles that we face as a writer, with the uncertainty of the process itself. So like, we've talked about the uncertainty as a reader of going through it and wondering what's going to happen, but there is a parallel uncertainty of a writer as they're writing the story. So that's what I wanted to get into with this excerpt.
Cool.
So it begins. We have already seen that the most powerful tool a storyteller has is ambiguity. And the effect of ambiguity is unpredictable by its nature. In fact, not only is it unpredictable, but it only becomes more unpredictable as it grows more powerful, as it shakes deeper and deeper foundations in the reader's mind. Powerful, stirring writing is even harder to tame and guide toward a goal than bland prose. But it is not only the reader whose experience is hard to control. The writer, too, may feel like a potter whose clay bucks and slips at her grip, even working with intense, singular focus. She finds that the work fails to conform to her vision. Under her very eyes, it takes on a shape that she did not intend. If writers rejected every work that followed this path, very little of value would be published. Even when the creative process leads somewhere unexpected, it is still possible to produce valuable work. It is even possible to produce work whose impact lies somewhat close to the writer's intention. But an artist must have humility. An artist must yield somewhat to the unexpected twists and turns that emerge in her own creative process. The stronger the impact the artist intends, the more humility she will need to achieve it.
Thank you. That's awesome. Brilliant. And so again, you can get your copy at LeanPub, which is really cool because it's a pay what you can publishing house. I think that's so cool. And also there's more writing. You write. So, check out Mattias's writing at mattiasandspace.substack.com. That will also be in the description as well. And I'll make sure to get The Goer in the description as well. And you also recommended a Stever Pinker book. You talked about that. We'll get a link to that, and we'll put that in the description as well. So all of the resources Mattias has talked about will be available to you there. So as we wrap up, I have a couple of questions for you, Mattias. What are your future plans for how to do things with stories?
That is a great question. And as you know, Melody, we're about to enter into National Novel Writing Month. Yes. And you and I will be collaborating on a series of write-ins. So we're going to be working on our own project in the company of other writers, and we're going to be writing about whatever we want to write about. So it might be fiction, it might be nonfiction, it might be a series of blog posts. I still don't quite know what I'm going to be working on. It might be a little bit of all three. But I know that one thing I want to be working on, this is how it connects to your question, Melody, is applying how to do things with stories to the problems that real writers other than myself are struggling with as they embark on their creative process. Yeah. So one aspect of our write-ins is going to be a little bit of workshopping about, what kind of story am I trying to tell? What impact do I want to have? And of course, the goal with National Novel Writing Month is just to get the words on the page. And I don't intend to undercut that. I don't want to make things too cerebral too early in the process.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a good thing to be thinking about from the very beginning of the writing process. And I would love to just talk to people who are working on any kind of writing project and see how the lessons from my book might help them, and what I might learn from looking at the questions they're asking.
Yeah. No, that's great. And well, I think that when you're doing NaNoWriMo, writing community is, well, even when you're not doing NaNoWriMo, writing in community is really valuable. I also think that write-ins, like, having a place for a group of authors to write together, super valuable. And if somebody wants to take a few minutes at the beginning to give some, to workshop a little bit, that can often spur, ideas and inspire the people who, because sometimes you come to the writing because you're not sure what to write. And then somebody workshops with you for a few minutes and you're like, oh, I know. And I think that can be really useful. So I'm super excited about that as well. I was going to ask you if you're working on a writing project right now or what it is, but apparently you are, but you don't know what it is yet. And you have 3 days to figure it out. So,
okay, well.
No pressure, Mattias, no pressure.
Well, no, I do have an answer to that question. I have a novel that I'm working on. I just don't quite know if it's what I'll be working on exclusively or if I'll be, balancing it with other projects. So I can field that question if you'd like.
Sure. So is it related to The Goer or?
No. I have a book. The title is called Draft 403, and it's a little bit more like it's realistic fiction, a little bit more based on certain episodes from my life. The central idea is that someone's trying to write an email to an ex-lover that is just the right combination of words to make things better. But he's going through that tortured process that writers have of not being able to find the right way in, not finding the thing that he believes will fix everything. So it's a litany of failed attempts to write the perfect letter to your ex.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm excited. I'll be excited to read that. That sounds like so much. I don't know. So I want to say it sounds like painful fun. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's the angle. If you've ever seen the play Waiting for Godot,
yes,
it's in that vein. So it might be painful, but it also will be funny.
Fun, yes. Thank you, Mattias, so much for sharing your message today and sharing your ideas. Really appreciate it. If you're out there listening and you haven't joined Author Nation Facebook group, now is a great time to do that. And next week, I'm going to be talking to Andrea Glass, and we're going to be talking about clarity and confidence in your writing. So join us then.